Alliances are shifting around the world unlike anything that's been seen since the end of the Cold War. As President Donald Trump casts doubt over where America's allegiances lie, the world powers are shifting their priorities. While Canada and Europe are figuring out their next moves, a clue as to where the focus of international community is shifting to may come from Turkey. After a 40-year insurgency, the outlawed Kurdish group, the PKK, agreed on a ceasefire deal with Ankara. That announcement was made days later, reportedly by Turkey offering to send peacekeepers to Ukraine. Is Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who is known to be a middleman between NATO and Russia, appearing to back up Europe? And that as questions swirl around whether the war in Ukraine will soon end or escalate. And amongst all, what can we find out about the position Iran finds itself in within the Middle East, given it has backed Russia? With us today to discuss these questions is Henri Barkey, an adjunct senior fellow for Middle East Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations in Washington, D.C.
There's never been a leader who stands much more for Russia than Trump. So it is quite possible that the Russians will put some pressure on the Iranians, whether it's real or make-believe.
I'm Negar Moshahedi, and this is Eye for Iran. Henri Barkey from the Council of Foreign Relations in Washington, D.C. joins us now. Thank you so much for joining Eye for Iran.
Thank you for inviting me.
My pleasure. Let's start off with the PKK ceasefire. Now, for many, this development came as a surprise, but there has been talks for several weeks now between Erdogan's party, also the Nationalist Action Party, as well as Kurdish officials. What's behind Erdogan's calculated shift on Kurds? And more importantly, why now?
Well, first of all, it appears as the negotiations behind the scenes started almost a year ago. We only heard about it in the last few months when Erdogan's ally, the Turkish nationalist leader, an arch-nationalist who has always been one of the most anti-Kurdish voices in Turkey, made an overture to the Kurdish party in parliament. And that's how things started to roll. But clearly, some things had already been put in motion in advance. In a way, it's very simple. What Erdogan is seeking here is a new constitution that will allow him to run again. The current constitution prevents a president to be re-elected after 2 terms. Right? 2 terms is the maximum. But he needs to change the constitution. He doesn't have enough votes to do that in parliament. He has his own party and the nationalists with whom are his allies. But if the Turkish Kurdish party, the DEM party, were to join, then he will get enough votes. And then the constitution can be changed and he can run again. Mind you, the next elections in Turkey are in 2028, so there is some time to do that. But he is a little bit in a rush because he would like to get this out of the way. But as I will point out during this interview, there are some very interesting contradictions at the same time. But this is what is driving Erdogan. Now, it is also true that he would like to be able to say that he ended the PKK insurrection. The PKK insurrection started almost 40 years ago. And even though the leader of the PKK, the guy who started all of this, is in jail and has been in jail since 1999, the insurrection hasn't ended, and the Kurds in Turkey have essentially resisted the Turkish state, both as politically, but also through armed struggle. However, the armed struggle hasn't been going very well recently. I mean, the PKK has been weakened. The Turkish state has managed to put enormous amount of military pressure on the PKK. And the PKK is mostly based in northern Iraq, in the mountains of northern Iraq. And so, but still, it's a threat. Occasionally, they manage to do things. And so Erdogan would like to be able to say, look, I dealt with it. But clearly, it's the reason it's happening now is because the PKK also realizes, especially Öcalan, that they're not going to defeat the Turkish state. There's really no point anymore in having an armed struggle. In fact, if you get rid of the armed struggle, then it will be much easier for Kurds to engage politically. Because at the moment, we can talk later about this, there's enormous amount of pressure on Kurdish legal political activity. So it works in some ways for both parties. But there's a Syrian component, but we can talk about that later, which is very critical to this.
Can you go into that Syrian component? Is part of this a result of the fall of Bashar al-Assad?
No. So when you look at the situation in Syria today, you will see that northeastern Syria, and actually a significant part of eastern Syria, is under the control of the PYD, which is the Syrian Kurdish movement. The Syrian Kurdish movement is an ally of the United States. There are at the moment 2,000 troops, American troops, in northeastern Syria working with the Syrian Kurds against ISIS. The PYD, or SDF, depending on how you want to call it, SDF stands for Syrian Democratic Forces, are a very powerful military force. People think maybe there may be as many as 30,000 to 80,000 fighters under both men and women.
Significant number.
Right. I mean, HTS, who runs Syria, came down to Damascus with only 30,000 troops. So in some ways, the SDF is a very formidable force. But the SDF was created by the PKK. It's an offshoot of the PKK. But it has assumed its own identity, its own personality, and it is a Syrian Kurdish force. The reason it's important, the reason the Americans are there is because, if you remember, when ISIS emerged and created the caliphate in 2016, it conquered all of northern Syria, it conquered northern Iraq, it conquered Mosul, they created a caliphate, and in the process defeated just about every military in the region you can think of. President Obama at the time asked the Turkish president Erdogan to come in with him into northern Syria to fight ISIS. And Erdogan said no.
Why is that?
In part because the Syrian Democratic Forces, the Kurdish force, was already there, was a significant force, but Erdogan thought that ISIS would take care of them. Erdogan did not like the fact that there was a Syrian force in northern, a Syrian Kurdish force, because what the Turks are most afraid of is that, just like the Iraqi Kurds who managed to get a federal arrangement in Iraq, that Syrian Kurds will also do the same. And if Syrian Kurds do it, guess who's next in their mind? Paradoxically, Erdogan, by saying no, kind of forced the Americans to make an alliance with the Syrian Kurds to defeat ISIS, and they did. I mean, the SDF, and we also have to appreciate the fact that the SDF it lost 11,000 soldiers or fighters in the struggle against ISIS. So the Americans have a great deal of appreciation for that. Now, for what is very difficult for Erdogan is the fact that, in a way, he made a mistake back when Obama had asked him for help, because in the intervening 8+ years, the American-Syrian Kurdish relationship has gotten stronger and stronger. And if you go back a little bit in history, you will remember that if the Iraqi Kurds managed to get a federal arrangement in Iraq, it's very much because the United States was involved. So in some ways, now the Turks are very afraid that the United States is going to do exactly the same thing it did in Iraq, kind of force some kind of, not necessarily a federal arrangement, but an autonomous arrangement for the Kurds. And that you have to understand that psychologically makes the Kurdish question much more salient, because it internationally, it says that the Kurds deserve autonomy, democracy where they live. And Turkish Kurds will want the same thing. And that terrifies the Turks.
Now, you talked about the domestic issues and wanting to get reelected and some sort of national pride for Erdogan. If Erdogan can deal with the Kurdish issue domestically, will that allow him to strengthen his hand regionally, especially in light of how, defeated and weakened Iran has been in 2024 and into 2025? Will they, in some ways, try and fill the hole or the gap that Iran is seemingly leaving behind in Iraq, in Syria, and in parts of the Middle East?
Definitely. I would say that one of Turkey's greatest handicaps has been its inability to deal with the Kurdish question. And you have to realize that it's not just a question of the PKK. I mean, it's not the fact that there is an armed group that is in existence and basically is based in Iraq for the most part. But it is also the fact that here you have a NATO country, a country that has always claimed to be European and etc., which is in the process of repressing not just the Kurds, I should say, Turks as well, but it is very, very focused on the Kurds. And Kurdish journalists, Kurdish activists, Kurdish NGO people, Kurdish teachers, get jailed right, left, and center all the time. And this is a little bit the contradiction I alluded to earlier, that you have Erdogan who's talking about, or who's giving his consent to a discussion on ending the insurgency, opening up the Turkish political system, making it more democratic, while, as I said, every day people are being jailed. And in Turkey, the justice system is completely under the control of Erdogan. So you can go to jail because somebody says, "Oh, you published a tweet 7 years ago that insulted the president." They'll bring you in front of a judge. The judge will say, "Okay, you'll be arrested pending your court case," which may take 6 months. For 6 months, you may be in jail until you get your day in court, just because you sent a tweet 7 years ago. I mean, so this is a level of repression at the moment, which is clearly insufferable. It has to do not just because of the Kurds, but it's also because Erdogan feels very insecure at the moment. He's been in power for 22 years, right? And let's face it, 22 years is a long time, and people would like to see somebody else. And he's trying to maneuver to stay another, let's say, another 8 years on top of the 22. That will be 30 years. So he needs to get the constitutional change in place, be sure that and then focus on how to make himself electable again. At the moment, he would not. And he's doing his utmost to eliminate opponents and so on and so forth. But that's a contradiction, in Turkey at the moment.
So in Erdogan's quest, as you said, for, I guess, more power and potentially regional hegemony and that clashing with the Islamic Republic of Iran, there's a very fine kind of delicate relationship between Iran and Turkey. How would you characterize their relationship right now, where they're at? In terms of, especially, we're seeing potentially Turkey moving closer towards Ukraine. Reuters is reporting, as per their sources, that Turkey is offering to have peacekeepers on the ground, and then Iran's relationship with Russia and reports that Iran has supplied Russia with ballistic missiles and drones. Where does that leave Turkey and Iran right now?
Look, Iran and Turkey have had kind of a difficult relationship, especially because of with the ascent of Erdogan. There's a way in which both Turkey and Iran are revisionist powers. I mean, Erdogan has turned Turkey into a revisionist power. Yes, it is a member of NATO, but on the other hand, Erdogan has huge ambitions, not just for Turkey, but for himself as well. And he made those very clear decades ago, I mean, where he thinks Turkey should be the leader of the Islamic world. Not that the Islamic world has chosen him as a leader, but he thought Turkey should be a permanent member of the Security Council. I mean, he really wants Turkey to be the primary power in the region. Now, Iran has been a revisionist power, as we have seen all these years, and but the Turks have. You would think that because of Iran, the Arabs, especially the Gulf Arabs, would have warmed up to Erdogan and brought him on board and use him as an ally against Iran. They haven't, because they see him as a threat to themselves as well because of his own ambitions. So you can think of essentially a three-pointed star there, or a triangle, I should say, where you have Iran, Turkey, and the Arab world, essentially three different sources of power in the region, each balancing each other out. And the Arabs obviously have better relations with the Turks than they have with the Iranians, but they are also very wary of the Turks and what the Turks want to do. So the Turks always wanted, to contain the Iranians, and in some ways, the Iranians essentially sabotaged themselves recently with what they did, but and that has worked to Turkey's advantage. But there has been a little bit of tension between the two. But for the most part, look, the Turkish-Iranian border has been fairly stable. There's been really no problem across the border. They both have essentially PKK elements in their countries. I mean, the Iranian Kurds also are seeking their rights, and Iranian Kurds are divided among three different, shall we say, political views, parties, you call it, and one of them is PJAK, is essentially an offshoot of the PKK. So you can argue that on that point, the Turks and the Iranians have a common objective. I mean, they would like to suppress Kurdish ambitions in their own countries and in the region in general. So there they have common, shall we say, interests. But they do also clash a little bit in northern Iraq, because both Turkey and Iran would like to influence Iraqi Kurds and have the Iraqi Kurds. And the Iraqi Kurds themselves are divided. The KDP, of Mr. Barzani's, are closer to the Turks, and the PUK, which is in Soleimani, are closer to the Iranians. So there is clash in Iraq as well in terms of influence.
And what did you make of that Reuters report that Turkey has offered to have, peacekeepers on the ground in Ukraine?
That is actually a helpful, shall we say, effort or a sign that the Turks are basically saying, look, if there is a peace deal or a ceasefire, something of the sort between Russia and Ukraine, given what Trump is doing at the moment, that the Turks are willing to send peacekeeping troops. Because if you remember, Zelensky is saying that he will not agree to any deal with the Russians because the Russians always break the ceasefire. And that was his argument at the White House with Trump, is that you can't trust the Russians. So the Turks are basically saying we can send peacekeeping troops, and in some ways they're trying to make themselves relevant. Right? They're trying to be a player, and this is part of Erdogan's general, shall I put it, effort to make Turkey much more relevant and much more important, and of course himself
On the world
process.
stage, right? Yeah.
On the world stage, yes.
And how would you then characterize Turkey's relationship with Ukraine and even Turkey's relationship with Russia as, a member of NATO, yet seemingly having relations with Russia as well?
Well, I mean, the Turks have had essentially a foreign policy that is increasingly different, separate than from NATO. In fact, what has been very disconcerting, I don't know how the Trump administration is going to react to any of this, but when you look at Erdogan and what his government has been saying, most of the time they attack the United States. They say nothing critical of Russia or China or any of the countries that are potentially adversaries. But most of the diatribe, most of the criticism is directed at the United States. They blame the United States for Turkey's economic problems. They blame the United States for the failed 2016 coup. They've blamed the United States for just about anything under the sun. Right? That comes, in a way, it's cheap. It's a way of finding an excuse for your own failures. I mean, that's for Erdogan. And unfortunately, polls in Turkey show that when you ask Turks, who's your most important enemy, 70%, believe it or not, will say the United States.
Wow.
This is right. Imagine a NATO country. I mean, there's no such thing in any other NATO country. And so the Turks have...
That's very interesting. Starting Trump is very interesting, especially when you compare it to Iran, where a lot of regular, I'm not talking about the government of Iran, but regular everyday Iranian people do not see the United States as their enemy at all.
Right. Despite Iranian government...
exactly.
Shall we say, speeches and everything. I mean, what comes out of the Iranian government. But in Turkey, it's different. I mean, it's actually quite interesting, and part of the reason Erdogan gets away with it is because the Americans have decided not to push him on it. They ignored it. They decided it's not important enough because they need certain things from the Turks, and the Turks need some certain things from the Americans. So you have a modus vivendi. So, but to come back to your question about relationship with Russia, the Turks have had a decent relationship with Russians. They sell all kinds of equipment. There's been a great deal of sanction busting through Turkey, where the Turks have made money out of this. But formally, they have stood by the NATO alliance. They have to. Now, what happens now with Trump's, shall we say, behavior, we do not know. I mean, we don't know if that's going to open up more opportunities for the Turks to engage the Russians, because at the end of the day, Russia is an important market for Turkish goods. It is also, as I said earlier, it's important. Turkey is an important conduit for sanction busting, and also Russia is a source of energy for Turkey, and Turkey's geographic location is such that you can export energy to Europe, to the Mediterranean through Turkey. So and consume it at home as well. So that from that perspective, under Trump, they may find themselves, or they may feel that the relationship between NATO and the United States is so bad at the moment that they can get away with more. We'll have to see, right? But the Turks are going to look. They're smart enough that they will try to take advantage of the situation, both by offering troops for a ceasefire in Ukraine and cozy up to the Russians much more. I mean, they can do both at the same time. And
So it wouldn't anger the Russians in any way if that report is true. That wouldn't anger the Russians anyway.
I don't think so, because it actually makes, look, I think a ceasefire at the moment is something that the Russians would want. Ukraine is doing it under duress. Ukraine does not want the war to end because, whether it's realistic or not, Ukraine thinks that, it wants to fight because it's their territory which is under Russian control, and they want that territory back. But a ceasefire may solidify Russian positions and solidify, Russian positions in eastern Ukraine, i.e. Russians will be able to dig in eastern Ukraine and consolidate their occupation of eastern Ukraine. And that's what Ukrainians are very afraid of. And they're also afraid that Trump is going to put pressure on them and say, accept the current situation as the peace line in the end. And that's not what the Ukrainians and Europeans, by the way, want. So sending peacekeeping troops from that perspective is not, I don't think the Russians would object to, because in some ways it helps the Russians more than anything else.
And also, speaking of President Trump, who you just mentioned, Russia is seeking to serve as some sort of mediator between the United States and Iran. What do you make of all of that, especially in the broader regional context of the shifting geopolitical plates here in Turkey as well?
Look, that's a great question. That's something I was thinking about this morning, actually, because, look, we don't know the relationship between Trump and Putin. I mean, I think this is a great puzzle here in Washington. People are really dumbstruck at the moment. It is quite possible that, given what Trump has already done for Putin, he stopped arms shipments to Ukraine, he stopped intelligence sharing with Ukraine, he lambasted Zelensky in front of the international media at the White House. I mean, look, there's never been a leader who's done much more for Russia than Trump. So it is quite possible that the Russians will put some pressure on the Iranians, whether it's real or make-believe, I don't know, but to get a deal on the nuclear stuff. Now, Trump would very much like a diplomatic deal with Iran, one that, let's assume, that will completely stop the Iranian nuclear program, and then he'll be able to say, you see, I did it and nobody else could do it, and I did it because I was tough. And he has actually increased the level of sanctions on Iran. And this is where, by the way, the Turks and Iranians have had a little bit of a shall we say, disagreement, because the Turks have gone along with the increased sanctions, much to the distress of the Iranians. So, and there's been a kind of a little bit of a tiff between the two foreign ministries in Tehran and Ankara. That said, it is possible that Putin will make it, will convince, encourage, I don't know, or put pressure on the regime in Iran to make a deal. But as you know better than I do, the regime in Iran is divided at this stage between the government and the deep state, so to say, as to what they want to do. But Trump would very much prefer a diplomatic solution than, ironically, than a military solution. He speaks tough, but that's part of his MO. I mean, by being unpredictable and being very aggressive, he thinks that countries will ultimately adhere to what he wants them to do.
And how do you see Russia and Iran? Like, how would you describe, is it a strategic partnership, a relationship of necessity? And in this whole process that you just described and Trump wanting a diplomatic solution, would Russia, in some ways, you said that, yes, they would try and pressure Iran for a deal, but would they in some ways kind of, as some analysts are saying, maybe sell Iran out, or do you not see that happening?
No, look, at the end of the day, right, Iran, until now, because we have to kind of separate Iran before the Israelis struck Iran and defeated Hezbollah and all these other groups.
Yeah, it's changed the whole landscape and the endgame, yeah.
But before that, Iran was a very useful, even if not a direct instrument of the Russians, but a useful actor on the international scene, because it created so many problems for the United States and its allies, right? It was it continuously undermined, right, the pro-American forces, whether in the Arab world or the West. Just think of the Houthis, for instance, being able to completely stop shipping through the Suez Canal, etc. I mean, that's actually quite significant. I mean, costing the companies a huge amount of.
Yeah, I mean, they almost put global shipping to a halt, right?
Exactly. Not to a halt, but they had to redirect the global shipping, but that's very, very costly. But so this is a kind of actor, it may not even have to be your ally, the actor in the international scene that Putin likes very much. I don't think that Putin would like to lose that card, and because Trump is here now, but he's going to be gone in 4 years, and we may have a completely different government in the United States that will return to the status quo ante, right, of today, and not be as nice to Putin and push. So this is not. Putin does not want regime change in Iran, let me put it this way, but would like to be able to give something to Trump that Trump will say, you see, I was nice to Putin and I got something back in return, right? So everything is transactional at the moment. And Putin is also transactional, like Trump. I mean, for Putin, he sees the United States as his main opponent and will try to undermine, and that's what he's done. But that's part of the, it goes back to the Cold War. I mean, it's not that different than what we had during the Cold War. So the relationship is not going to change between Iran and Russia. What I'm actually curious is whether or not the Iranians are still capable of selling the Russians ballistic missiles and drones, etc., when their stocks have been depleted so much by the fighting with the Israelis.
Would that sever this transactional relationship then, if that were to happen, like you're saying? You know, the war ends and Iran stops sending, Russia would no longer need these ballistic missiles and drones coming from Iran. Would that in some ways jeopardize this transactional relationship between Russia and Iran in some ways?
No, it won't. For the reasons as I gave before, is that the Russians would like to have Iran as a revisionist actor who undermines Western interests, because Iran is not going to change from that perspective, right? Until there is real change in Iran, that's not going to happen, and therefore Iran is going to be a thorn on the side of the Americans, and that's what the Russians want.
So is Trump's, as you put it, transactional relationship then between Russia and the United States, would that have the unintended consequence of making this anti-Western access between Russia, China, and Iran stronger? Would that in some ways make Iran stronger in that sense, the Islamic Republic, the leaders of the country, I'm saying?
No, I don't. I mean, I think the Iranian Islamic Republic is actually at the moment on its weakest point, right? So there is very serious talk that the Israelis would like to hit the Iranians again, and they would like to do it with the Americans, together with the Americans. And there's a way in which that's an incentive for the Iranians to work with the Russians to get a deal. And the Russians or the Chinese are not going to defend the Iranians, right? Paradoxically, when the Iranians fired all those missiles, Europe, the Arab world, the United States, and Israel created essentially a wall and shot down most of the missiles together. Iran doesn't have any such allies. It's not as if Hezbollah or Hamas or the Houthis or the Iraqi militias can defend Iran from a sophisticated missile attack, right? So Iran has no ally from that perspective, and the Russians are not going to help the Iranians, in part because it's probably very hard, and B, because that would really upset the Americans. So Iran is very alone at the moment, and so nothing makes it, shall we say, stronger. What will make it stronger eventually, I would say, is if Iran succeeds because of mistakes the Americans and the Israelis and others make, and manages to rearm itself and rebuild its stocks, both of missiles and also air defense. But that will take time. So there is a window at the moment where Iran is very vulnerable.
Yeah, a very isolated country for sure. And speaking of Israel, what are your thoughts on Israel's actions in Syria right now?
Well, I mean, the Israelis are very, very worried about HTS because at the end of the day, the origins of HTS is on Nusra and maybe even ISIS, because let's not forget that the leader of Syria at one point, Shara, fought with. I mean, that's how he came into, shall we say, into his own, was as a fighter for ISIS. So they don't trust the regime in Syria. So they've been essentially, and I should also say that the regime in Syria has done very little to alleviate not Israeli fears, but in general, by not invite. He had a national convention. It did not invite any of the minorities, the Kurds, the Druze, the Alawites, the Christians, you name it. Right? It was essentially and when you look at the people Shara has appointed, they're all people were very, very close to him. There's no diversity. So there is a fear, but the Israelis also are risking, and by going too far into trying to punish the Iranians, the Syrians, and forcing the Syrians essentially to look for allies. I mean, also what you're seeing in Syria is a growing competition between Turkey and Israel. It's not a competition. When I say competition, one has to be careful in that they're not competing for influence. They're not competing for market access. The Turks have access. The Turks have a good relationship with Shara and HTS. The Israelis don't. But the Israelis would like to deter and the Syrians from becoming stronger and threaten them in the future. But the Turks are kind of taking a position, an anti-Israeli position in Syria, and thereby getting in a good stead, if you want, of the Syrian government and Syrian public. It's very touchy. I mean, and the Israelis at the moment are facing essentially many different fronts still. And Gaza being the most important because the ceasefire is over, they have to decide what's going to happen next. But they cannot afford to make things worse with the Syrians. I think they've established positions now that I think are temporary, but they will stay in those positions so that they can watch what the Syrians are doing. And look, the other thing you have to remember about...
Is HTS okay with that?
No, but the other thing you have to remember about HTS is that HTS is not a powerful military. HTS is not capable of stopping, let's say, a reorganization of Hezbollah, for example, in Syria, or for ISIS to come in from other parts of Syria and lodge itself in the south, just across the border from Israel. Right? So those are the concerns that the Israelis have about the Syrians, because it's not just that Syrians may be ill-intentioned, it's just that they're not capable. I mean, they don't have the forces. As I said earlier, I mean, HTS, there's a way in which it has done certain things well in government, but it has not been able to control Syrian territory. All right. It was not an army. I mean, in a way, think about it. Nobody, including HTS, thought that they would succeed when they started the push to. They weren't pushing for Damascus. They were trying to go to Aleppo. I mean, this is what you would call a catastrophic success. Right? They didn't expect it, and they ended up in Damascus. But they certainly didn't have the wherewithal. It's just that the Syrian army just evaporated, and they could walk into Damascus. But you see that the Druze, for example, in the south, have now organized, showing a great deal of resistance, and they are very wary of HTS precisely because of where HTS is coming from.
So could this all just fall apart?
Well, Syria fall apart?
Yes.
Oh, yes. I mean, look, if you're a betting person, it's not a unreasonable bet, right? At the moment, it is not in the interest of any of the neighboring countries, whether it's Iraq, Turkey, the Arab world, or even Europe for that matter, for Syria to collapse. I mean, they would like, but so there is support for HTS and Shara, but Shara has to be careful in that he may create essentially the conditions for another internal struggle between the minorities and HTS. And so he's fighting essentially two things. I mean, both kind of his conception and his organization's conception towards the Kurds, the Druze, etc. But also, people expect HTS to provide, the proverbial tomatoes in the market. I mean, all of these things that people have suffered in Syria with a terrible economy, and HTS, if it cannot deliver economically, ordinary Syrians are also going to turn against it. All right, so it's a delicate situation for HTS. I mean, I don't envy them, and you can argue that so far they've done, at least from what you can see from the outside, etc., an okay job. But we know very little about the decision-making process, who they rely on, and so on and so forth.
Now, you talked earlier about how Israel's actions in Syria may force HTS to look for more allies. And you also talked about a very weakened Iran, a very isolated Iran. And of course, al-Shara has taken on a very anti-Iranian stance. Is there any chance that Iran could ever reestablish itself or its influence in some way in Syria ever again, or is it that's done?
I think that's done. I think the Syrians and HTS especially blame Iran for propping Assad in power all these years, that Assad would not have succeeded in staying in power this long, or even winning the civil war if it wasn't for Iranian support. And we should remember that the Syrians, think of Shara and his entourage and all the people who fought with him. They all lost a lot of people fighting Assad, and Assad was particularly cruel. I mean, he just razed cities to the ground, and we saw the images that came out from the prisons. All those people are not going to forget who really was responsible, who really propped up Assad. And Assad, let's be honest, Assad would not have survived had it not been for the Iranians and the Russians.
Going back to Turkey, if we could just conclude on this, what the trajectory that Turkey is on right now, the way you see it going, and is that indicative in any way of kind of the direction the Middle East is going in general and all these shifting geopolitical plates?
Look, a good question, because, when Erdogan came to power, he tried to improve relations with just about everybody, right? The Europeans, the Americans, the region, and the initial road he chose was one of democratization, opening up, basically saying, look, a Muslim, because he came in as a Muslim politician, could be both pro-Western and democratic at the same time. And that phased out because it turns out that he really never meant it, all those reforms that he was introducing. All he was trying to do is get support from the outside for himself against the Turkish military, which was the dominant force. Once the Turkish military was defeated politically by Erdogan and the Turkish public, then you saw Erdogan shifting. Initially, Erdogan was seen as a great leader in the Middle East. Everywhere in the Middle East, he was viewed very, very positively. But with time, that image shifted. It shifted primarily because of two reasons. One is he started seeing himself above everybody else and tried to impose his will, tried to shape the Middle East, just like the Iranians had tried to do. Shape the Middle East to that Turkey would be the most important, the primus inter pares. And that Turkey would dominate, Turkey would shape the Middle East. Well, by the time, let's say, a few years ago it came, Turkey was alone. Turkey was had no friends. So he shifted policies. He started trying to improve relations with Egypt. He had called Sisi all kinds of names. He said, I would never shake his hand. And he went to Cairo and shook Sisi's hand. He tried to improve relations with Assad. And some people say that, argue, and I think that there's some merit to this argument, that when you look at the HTS initial push into Syria, before it became obvious that he was going to go all the way to Damascus, that it was essentially the Turks were encouraging HTS to do it because they had tried to improve relations with Assad, and Assad was basically saying, no, I'm not going to talk to you, Erdogan, because you're occupying huge chunks of Syrian territory. Get out of the Syrian territory, then I will talk to you. And the HTS push initially was a way to put pressure on Assad to talk to Erdogan. But essentially, it goes to show you that Erdogan had found himself completely isolated and was trying to get back into the good graces of many of the countries in the region. So, but now we have a completely changed strategic situation in the Middle East, and no one at the moment has any dominant say, so to say, in the Middle East, and it's up for grabs. It's up for grabs, but the advantage that everybody has is that Iran has been built out. That Iran for the foreseeable future is not going to be able to do what it used to do in the past, but we'll have to see how things end up.
And Henri, you are known as one of the most brilliant minds when it comes to Turkey. No, seriously.
No, I would not say that.
Can you? No, for real, you are. Can you, just so our audience gets to know you a little bit better, tell us in brief a little bit about your journey in this field of expertise?
Well, I started working on Turkey. Not because I had to, I was working, I started my career essentially, or my PhD, as a Latin Americanist, and I was looking at military coups and how military coups changed the politics and economics of many Latin American countries when the Turks had a military coup. And suddenly I said, oh, here's something, I mean, I know Turkish, etc. And so the Turkish coup happened, and the Turkish coup became essentially a replicate, if you want, of the coups in Argentina, Brazil, Chile. So a lot of people have written about Latin America, so nobody's writing on Turkey, so I'll do that. And that's how I started. Eventually, I wrote about Turkish political economy and so on and so forth. And then I got interested in the Kurdish question, and I wrote a lot about the Kurds, which did not endear me to the Turkish governments over the years. But then in 2016, there was an attempted coup in Turkey that failed, and I was there at the time. I was running a conference. I was at the Wilson Center. I was running a conference on how the Middle East perceived JCPOA, Obama's JCPOA. So the idea was, I was running the program. I had a grant to do this, and so instead of bringing everybody from the Middle East to Washington, I said, I'll do it in Istanbul. It's because it's easier to bring people to Istanbul. Plus, it's a nice place to have a meeting, and I found a perfect place on an island near Istanbul. And the coup happened. It didn't succeed. We did our conference. We finished our work. And then a few days later, I returned to Washington. And then the Turkish government started accusing me as being one of the organizers of the coup. So since 2016, if you look at the Turkish press, I'm supposedly a CIA agent. But they used me to blame the coup on the United States because I had been in the U.S. government for a short while working at the State Department, so I was a former official. And they could say, look, a former official was there in Turkey at the time, and they built up those conspiracy theories. And so I've been, but I've written, that's not the only stuff. I've written about other things on the Middle East and on political economy in general, but a lot of the stuff I've written, but I can't obviously go back to Turkey anymore because there's an arrest warrant for me in Turkey.
Thank you so much for joining Eye for Iran.
Thank you very much. This has been a wonderful conversation, and hope we'll do it again.
If you like this podcast, hit the like button, leave us a comment. We'd love to know what you think. The Eye for Iran podcast series is brought to you by Iran International, the go-to destination for expert Iranian news in both Farsi and English. For more, head to our dedicated English website, iranintl.com/en.